He was the most dangerous Nazi at the Nuremberg Trials, not because he was the most evil, but because he was the most believable. Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect, sold the world a brilliant lie, that he was just a talented artist, a good Nazi who knew nothing about the death camps. He charmed the judges, escaped the gallows, and died a wealthy, respected man. But decades later, a team of historians did what the prosecutors couldn't. They found the receipts that proved he was a calculating liar who built his empire on slavery and knew about the Holocaust all along. The year is 1945, and the ghosts of Europe have gathered in a courtroom in Nuremberg. The men in the dock are not merely men, they are the architects of a nightmare, the human wreckage of a fallen empire of death. There is Hermann Goering, a bloated peacock in a uniform now too big for his shrunken authority, spitting defiance and contempt. There are the thuggish fanatics, the dull-eyed functionaries, the ideologues whose words sent millions to their graves. It is a rogues' gallery of the damned, and the world watches, demanding an accounting. And then there is Albert Speer. He does not look like a monster. He looks like a university professor or a corporate director who has found himself in the wrong meeting. He sits straight-backed, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his face handsome, intelligent, his gaze direct and thoughtful. While the others shout or sulk or stare into space, Speer listens. He takes notes. He consults with his lawyer. He radiates an aura of sober rationality in a room thick with the stench of madness and genocide. When he speaks, his voice is not the guttural bark of a party fanatic, but the calm, measured tone of an educated man. He does not plead innocence, a plea that would be absurd. He pleads ignorance. He performs a piece of breathtaking political theater. He is the only one who accepts responsibility, but it is a carefully curated, abstract responsibility. He speaks of a collective guilt, of a nation's hypnosis. He talks of being seduced by Hitler's charisma, of making a Faustian bargain, a pact with the devil in exchange for the chance to build his monumental dreams. He admits to being part of a criminal machine, but he builds a firewall of denial around himself. The slave labor? That was the responsibility of others. The concentration camps? He never saw them. The Holocaust? He claims he never knew. He presents himself as the apolitical technocrat, the brilliant manager who was so focused on building roads and increasing tank production that he simply did not see the crematoria puffing smoke just over the horizon. And the world, desperate for a sign of humanity amidst the monstrous, wants to believe him. The Allied judges, the prosecutors, the press, they see in Speer a reflection of themselves. He is not one of them, the brutes and the fanatics. He is an educated man of culture who made a terrible mistake. He offers a comforting narrative that it is possible to serve evil without being evil oneself. But as he sits there, calm and articulate, crafting his defense with the same meticulous care he once used to design a stadium, another possibility hangs in the air. Is this genuine contrition born of a long, dark night of the soul? Or is it the opening night of the greatest performance of his life, a final, brilliant architectural project whose goal is not to build a monument of stone, but to construct a myth that will save his own neck? On the stand, under the weight of history, one question hangs in the air. Is Albert Speer the one good Nazi, or is he simply the smartest? Before the monuments of granite and the mountains of corpses, there was just Albert Speer, a man of quiet rooms and clean lines. He was born not into the resentful, grasping poverty that fueled so many of his future comrades, but into the heart of the German bourgeoisie. His father and grandfather were successful architects, and he grew up in a world of comfortable privilege, a world of classical music, intellectual pursuits, and the quiet rustle of blueprints. In the chaotic, feverish years of the Weimar Republic, As Germany tore itself apart in street fights between communists and fascists, Speer remained aloof. Politics to him was a vulgar noise, a messy, irrational business that interfered with the pure, mathematical beauty of his chosen craft. He was not a firebrand. He was a draftsman. His passions were for form, for structure, for the timeless elegance of Greek temples and the austere neoclassicism of his mentor, Heinrich Tessenow. He was, in essence, an apolitical man, a technician in a world of ideologues. His early career was promising, but not spectacular. He was competent, talented, and ambitious, but there was little sign of the revolutionary genius he would later be proclaimed. He was a man in a white architect's coat, more concerned with the stress calculations of a beam than with the seismic political shifts happening outside his window. Then, in 1930, out of a mixture of professional curiosity and peer pressure, he attended a Nazi Party rally. He did not go seeking a political savior. He went to see a spectacle. And a spectacle is what he found. He was not moved by the venomous anti-Semitic tirades or the crude social Darwinism. He was captivated by the aesthetics. He saw the power of the massed banners, the torchlight parades, the perfect, terrifying symmetry of thousands of men moving as one. It was architecture on a human scale, a raw demonstration of form and order imposed on chaos. And then he heard Hitler. But Speer did not hear a politician. He heard a fellow artist. He heard a man who spoke with a messianic passion about rebuilding Germany, about creating new cities, new monuments, new temples to a new faith. Here was a man who did not just talk of power, but of beauty, a brutal, megalomaniacal beauty, but beauty nonetheless. For an ambitious young architect, languishing in a republic that could barely afford to repair its public buildings, this was a siren song. Hitler was not just a leader. He was the ultimate client, a patron with the will to build on a pharaonic scale. In 1931, Albert Speer joined the Nazi Party. It was not a decision born of deep ideological conviction. It was a career move. It was the pragmatic choice of a man who saw an opportunity to build, to create, to escape the mundane, and attach himself to a force that was reshaping the world. The Nazi Party, for him, was not a cause to die for. It was a client to work for. He was exchanging his white coat for a brown shirt, but in his mind, he believed he could keep his hands clean, that he could remain the detached technician, a servant of art, and somehow stay above the filthy business of politics. It was the first and most fateful of his many self-deceptions. Albert Speer's ascent was not a slow climb. It was a vertical launch, powered by a single explosive burst of creative synergy. For a time, he was just another party architect, given minor, uninspiring commissions, designing banners, redecorating offices. He was a cog in the propaganda machine. But in 1934, he was given a chance to create not just a space, but a secular religion. He was asked to design the setting for the night rally at Tempelhof Field in Nuremberg. Faced with a vast, dark field and limited time and resources, Speer did not build a structure of stone. He built one of pure light. He requisitioned 150 anti-aircraft searchlights from the Luftwaffe and arranged them in a ring around the parade ground, pointing them straight up into the night sky. The effect was breathtaking, a moment of sublime, terrifying beauty. The beams merged miles above the field, creating a vast, roofless chamber of pure incandescence, a cathedral of light. It was a work of theatrical genius, a temple made of air and energy, and the man who saw himself as the high priest of this new German faith was mesmerized. Hitler had seen the future. Shortly after, Speer was summoned. He was ushered into the presence of the Führer, a man he had until then only admired from a distance. The meeting that followed was not a formal commission or a political briefing. It was an ecstatic, almost intimate meeting of two minds. Hitler, the failed artist, had finally found his hands, and Speer, the ambitious architect, had found his patron saint, a saint who commanded armies and could move mountains. Hitler did not act like a dictator. He acted like an excited collaborator. He unrolled his own crude architectural sketches, visions of colossal arches and vast domes that he had nursed since his lonely days as a painter in Vienna. His eyes, so often cold or filled with rage, burned with a passionate, creative fire. He did not give Speer orders. He shared his dreams. He spoke of outdoing Paris, of dwarfing Rome, of building a new world capital whose monuments would last 1,000 years and inspire awe in generations to come. In that moment, Speer was seduced. He was seduced not by power or ideology, but by the sheer, intoxicating scale of the opportunity. Here was a client who did not ask, "How much will it cost?" or "Is this practical?" but only, "Can it be made bigger?" For an architect, it was the ultimate fantasy come to life. A unique and deeply strange relationship was born. It existed outside the rigid hierarchies of the Nazi state. Speer was granted a privilege afforded to almost no one else: direct, informal access to the Führer. Their meetings were often late at night, after the political business of the day was done. They would hunch over models and blueprints for hours. Two artists lost in a shared dreamscape of granite and marble. Hitler would critique a façade. Speer would suggest a different calumniation. It was a Faustian collaboration, a symbiotic madness. Speer became the first architect of the Reich. He had Hitler's ear, his trust, and, most importantly, his protection. This bond created a bubble around Speer, an insulated reality where he could tell himself he was merely an artist, a servant of a grand historical vision, separate from the thugs and murderers who ran the state. He was not a politician. He was Hitler's personal architect. And in that special, privileged position, he was given his first great task: to design a new Berlin, the world capital that would be called Germania. The project known as Germania was more than a construction plan. It was a symphony of stone and megalomania, the architectural embodiment of the 1,000-year Reich. In their late-night sessions, hunched over an enormous scale model that occupied an entire room, Hitler and Speer were not just planning a city. They were designing a new center of the universe, a capital so vast and intimidating it would make ancient Rome look like a provincial town. It was the ultimate pact between the dictator's monstrous vision and the architect's boundless ambition. The plans were a study in superhuman scale, an architecture designed to crush the human spirit. A grand boulevard, wider than the Champs-Élysées, would carve a massive north-south axis through the heart of Berlin. At one end would stand a triumphal arch so colossal that its Parisian counterpart could fit comfortably within its opening. At the other end, the city's dark heart, would be the Große Halle, the Great Hall. This was the centerpiece of the entire mad vision, a domed assembly hall of such staggering proportions that St. Peter's Basilica in Rome could fit inside it several times over. Its unsupported dome would soar to nearly 1,000 feet, so vast that it was predicted to have its own internal weather system. The breath of 250,000 worshippers within might literally form clouds beneath its ceiling. This was an architecture of awe and terror. The sterile, endless plazas and the mountainous buildings were designed not for citizens, but for subjects, to make the individual feel like an insect before the monumental power of the state. Hitler and Speer even developed a theory of ruin value, meticulously planning how their creations would decay over 1,000 years, leaving behind picturesque, colossal ruins to rival the Colosseum, a final, morbid testament to their greatness. But this city of gods required a sacrifice of mortals. To build Germania, a vast swath of central Berlin had to be demolished. It was a problem of logistics, and Speer, in his new role as General Building Inspector for the Reich capital, approached it with the cold efficiency of a master technician. His department was tasked with clearing the land. This meant the demolition of over 50,000 homes, and it raised a simple question: where would the displaced residents go? The answer revealed the first ugly, indelible stain on Speer's pristine white coat. The solution was simple and brutal. The Aryan Germans displaced by the demolitions would be moved into apartments that were currently occupied by Berlin's Jewish population. The Jews, in turn, would be evicted. This was not a side effect of the project. It was an integral part of the plan, and Albert Speer was at the very center of it. His Nuremberg claim that he was merely an artist, unaware of the regime's persecution, crumbles to dust here. Surviving documents from his own office, some bearing his signature, show that he and his department worked hand in glove with the SS and the Gestapo. They meticulously catalogued vacated Jewish apartments, managing the flow of human misery with the same detached precision they used to manage the flow of concrete and steel. The eviction notices that forced Jewish families from their homes were a direct consequence of the blueprints Speer so lovingly drafted. Here, in the creation of his beautiful dream, Speer's hands became irrevocably dirty. He was no longer just an architect. He was a key functionary in the regime's policy of dispossession and racial persecution. The first stones of Germania were laid upon a foundation of stolen homes and shattered lives. The grand boulevards were paved, metaphorically, with eviction notices. The artist, in his quest to build a utopia of stone, had become an architect of cruelty. The invasion of Poland in 1939 was, for Albert Speer, an inconvenient interruption. The war put his grand passion on hold. The colossal budgets for Germania were diverted to the production of tanks and bombers. The quarries that were to provide marble for his great halls now churned out granite for coastal fortifications. The architect of the future was suddenly a man without a project, his purpose deferred. Then, on a foggy morning in February 1942, fate intervened. Dr. Fritz Todt, the powerful Minister of Armaments and War Production, was killed when his plane exploded shortly after takeoff from Hitler's headquarters. The position was now vacant and at the most critical juncture of the war. Germany was bogged down in the Russian winter, and the vast industrial might of the United States had entered the fray. The German war economy was a bureaucratic nightmare, a tangled mess of competing interests where the Army, Navy, Air Force, and powerful party bosses all fought for resources. Hitler needed a miracle worker. In a move that shocked the party hierarchy, he bypassed the old guard, the generals, and the industrialists. He turned to his architect. He summoned Speer and, with a simple handshake, handed him one of the most powerful positions in the Third Reich. Albert Speer, the artist, was now the master of Germany's war machine. And it was here that the second, more potent act of his myth began. He inherited a rusty, groaning engine and, with what seemed like sheer genius, made it hum with terrifying efficiency. He attacked the problem not as a politician, but as the supreme technocrat he always claimed to be. He gathered around him the brilliant engineers and industrialists of Germany, creating committees that cut through the layers of party bureaucracy. He centralized authority, standardized thousands of different weapon components, and forced the squabbling branches of the military to cooperate. He used his greatest weapon, his unique personal access to Hitler, to outmaneuver his rivals. When a regional party boss or a rival minister like Hermann Göring tried to interfere, Speer could go directly to the Führer and secure his blessing. He was the rational man in a court of fanatics, the calm voice of logic who spoke the language of production charts and efficiency curves. The results were nothing short of astonishing. This became known as the Speer miracle. In the 2 years following his appointment, even as Allied bombs rained down on German cities with ever-increasing ferocity, the production figures soared. Tank production tripled, aircraft production doubled, ammunition output skyrocketed. The German war machine, which should have been grinding to a halt, instead entered its most productive phase of the entire war. Speer, it seemed, was single-handedly prolonging the conflict, keeping the army supplied through sheer managerial brilliance. He perfected his public image. He was the man in the well-tailored suit, striding through factories, conferring with engineers, a picture of dynamic, non-ideological competence. He was not sending men to die. He was making the tools to defend the homeland. He was fighting a clean war, a war of slide rules, blueprints, and logistics. He was the good Nazi, the patriot serving his country in its hour of need, the apolitical expert who simply made the trains run on time. It was a masterful performance, and it was almost universally believed. But a miracle is, by definition, an event without a natural explanation, and Speer's miracle had a very natural and very dark explanation. A factory, no matter how efficient, requires two things: raw materials and human hands. And as Speer's production charts climbed ever higher toward the heavens, a terrible question lingered in the shadows. Where did all the workers come from to fuel this impossible miracle? The miracle of Albert Speer was built on mountains of human bones. Behind the gleaming production statistics, the impressive efficiency charts, and the smoothly purring machinery of the German war economy was a system of slavery so vast and brutal that it dwarfed the plantations of the antebellum South. Speer's factories did not just manufacture weapons, they consumed people. They ground through human lives with the same mechanical precision they used to stamp out tank components. By 1944, more than 7 million foreign workers toiled in the factories under Speer's command. They were not employees, they were prisoners, a vast, multinational army of the enslaved. They came from every corner of occupied Europe, Russians and Ukrainians rounded up in brutal sweeps across the conquered territories. French workers shipped east in cattle cars, Poles torn from their families, Italian soldiers captured after their country's surrender. They were herded into barracks, fed starvation rations, worked until they collapsed, and then replaced with fresh human cargo from the inexhaustible reservoir of Nazi conquest. And at the apex of this pyramid of misery were the concentration camp inmates, the Häftlinge, the most expendable workers of all. These were Jews, political prisoners, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and anyone else deemed undesirable by the state. They were rented out to Speer's industrial empire like pieces of equipment, their lives measured not in years, but in their capacity to produce material for the war effort. When they could no longer work, they were replaced. It was a business model of breathtaking, industrial-scale cruelty. Speer knew. The myth that he would later construct, that he was an innocent technocrat, insulated from the regime's crimes by his focus on production, crumbles to dust when confronted with the documentary evidence. His own appointment calendars show visits to concentration camps like Mauthausen. His signature appears on documents authorizing the use of camp labor. He attended conferences where the brutal reality of the slave system was discussed in clinical detail. He was not a man in an ivory tower, removed from the grim realities of his industrial empire. He was its architect and its commander. In one particularly damning incident, Speer personally toured the underground rocket factory at Mittelbau-Dora, a subterranean hell carved out of a mountain where inmates from the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp were forced to manufacture the V-2 rockets. The conditions were indescribable. Prisoners worked in unventilated tunnels filled with toxic dust, sleeping in their own filth, dying by the thousands from exhaustion, disease, and deliberate brutality. More people died building the V-2 rockets than were killed by them. Speer walked through this charnel house, inspected the production lines, and left satisfied with the efficiency of the operation. His post-war claim that he never saw the extermination camps is a carefully crafted lie. He may not have visited Auschwitz-Birkenau, but he presided over dozens of smaller camps, that were, in their own way, death factories. He created a system where human beings were reduced to units of production, where their deaths were factored into cost-benefit analyses, where their suffering was an acceptable price for meeting quotas. The Speer miracle was, in reality, the Speer Holocaust, a parallel genocide that used up human lives as fuel for the war machine. He was not just a minister, he was a slave master on an unprecedented scale. His factories were not monuments to German ingenuity, they were tombs that swallowed millions. The man who would later claim to be merely a cog in the machine was, in fact, one of its most essential components, the engineer who kept the entire apparatus of exploitation running with ruthless efficiency. The Nuremberg courtroom was a stage, and Albert Speer, more than any other man in the dock, understood the power of performance. While his co-defendants reacted with brutish defiance, pathetic excuses, or catatonic despair, Speer executed a maneuver of breathtaking psychological audacity. He did not deny his role, he redefined it. He did not plead innocence, he performed repentance. It was the single greatest act of his life, a calculated confession designed not to reveal the truth, but to obscure it forever. His strategy was a triptych of deception, each panel painted with masterful skill. The first panel was the acceptance of a vague, almost philosophical responsibility. He looked the judges in the eye and spoke of the collective guilt of the German people and its leaders. He was the first and only defendant to do so. This single act immediately set him apart. It gave him a veneer of credibility, of thoughtful introspection. He was not a fanatic screaming about betrayal. He was a reasonable man grappling with a historical catastrophe. While the truth, as we have seen, was that he was the master of slaves, the actor on the stand played the role of the diligent, blinkered manager who failed to look up from his desk. The second panel was the hypnosis defense. He painted a portrait of Hitler not as a political leader he chose to follow, but as a sorcerer, a demonic figure with a hypnotic power that paralyzed the will of all who came near him. In his telling, he was not a willing collaborator. He was a man under a spell. This brilliantly reframed his ambition as a tragic flaw, his service to the Reich as a form of enchantment. He was merely a man ensnared by a siren song, a Faust who had sold his soul for the chance to build, not for power or out of hatred. It was a romantic, almost literary defense that resonated deeply with a world trying to understand how a civilized nation could descend into such barbarism. The third and most crucial panel was the firewall of ignorance. Having established his general guilt and his hypnotic trance, he then meticulously denied knowledge of all the monstrous particulars. The Holocaust, a terrible secret kept by Himmler's fanatical SS, something he only heard rumors of. The brutal conditions of the slave laborers, the responsibility of his subordinate, Fritz Sauckel, the man who procured the workers. The death camps? He never saw them. He presented himself as a man in a silo, a technocrat so consumed with production quotas and supply chains that he had no time or inclination to investigate the human cost. He was a specialist, and genocide, he implied, was outside his area of expertise. Then came the masterstroke, the third act twist that transformed his character from a penitent sinner into a would-be hero. Towards the end of the trial, Speer testified that in the final apocalyptic days of the war, he had plotted to assassinate Hitler. He claimed he planned to introduce poison gas into the ventilation system of the Führer bunker. The plan, he said, was ultimately thwarted by technical obstacles. Whether this plot was real or a complete fabrication, its effect was electric. It completed his transformation. He was not just the man who woke up from the spell, he was the man who tried to slay the sorcerer. The performance was a triumph. The judges were swayed. While a dozen of his co-defendants were sentenced to hang, Albert Speer, the man who had worked millions to death to prolong the war, was spared the noose. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He had built many things in his life: stadiums, chanceries, factories. But in the Nuremberg dock, he had completed his masterpiece. He had become the architect of his own salvation. For the other 6 Nazi leaders who walked with him through the iron gates of Spandau prison, the sentence was an end. For Albert Speer, it was an intermission. He did not view the next 20 years as a punishment to be endured, but as a project to be managed. Spandau was not a tomb. It was the quiet, disciplined studio where he would become the architect of his own resurrection, meticulously designing and building the legend that would grant him a second life. He began by becoming the model prisoner. While his fellow inmates, like the increasingly erratic Rudolf Hess, railed against their fate or retreated into fantasy, Speer was a portrait of rational cooperation. He was polite to the guards of all 4 Allied nations. He adhered to every rule. He tended the prison garden with the same methodical care he had once used to plan autobahns. He created a persona of a man who had accepted his fate, a man of discipline and quiet dignity. It was the Nuremberg performance, extended over 2 decades. But behind this mask of placid compliance, a secret and monumental work was underway. Speer had a new commission, this one self-assigned: to write the definitive story of the Third Reich, with himself as its tragic, flawed, but ultimately reasonable protagonist. He began to write, secretly at first, on scraps of toilet paper, calendar pages, and tobacco wrappers. He cultivated relationships with sympathetic orderlies who smuggled his tiny coded notes out of the prison and delivered them to a trusted friend. What began as a trickle of contraband became a flood. Over his 20 years of imprisonment, Speer secretly wrote and smuggled out over 25,000 pages. This was not a memoir. It was a construction project. He was not simply recalling events. He was sculpting his own history. With the patient precision of an architect, he laid out his narrative, carefully polishing the sections that supported his myth and plastering over the cracks of his complicity. He refined the story of the apolitical technocrat, the artist seduced by a demon, the man who knew nothing of the horrors. It was his new Germania, built not of granite, but of words, and designed to stand for 1,000 years in the public imagination. His methodical nature found its most famous expression in the prison garden. To keep his mind and body from atrophying, he began a walking regimen. But this was Speer, so it could not be a simple stroll. He got books from the prison library and began to plan an imaginary journey. Measuring the circumference of the garden path, he began to walk around the world. Each day, he would walk his allotted miles, imagining himself trekking from Berlin across Asia. He crossed the Bosphorus, hiked through the mountains of Persia, and reached India. By the end of his sentence, he had walked over 30,000 kilometers, a journey that had taken him, in his mind, across Siberia and over the Bering Strait into America. On October 1st, 1966, the 20 years were up. The gates of Spandau opened, and Albert Speer, now a gray-haired man of 61, walked out into a world that had completely changed. But he was not an irrelevant relic emerging from a time capsule. He was a man armed with a manuscript, a polished and perfected legend, ready to be unleashed. He had survived prison. Now, he was ready to conquer history. When Albert Speer walked out of Spandau prison, he did not step into the shadows of infamy. He walked directly into a spotlight. He emerged into a world hungry for his story, a world fascinated by the evil he had served, and he fed it a tale so compelling, so reasonable, and so self-serving that it became an addiction. He had spent 20 years building his legend in secret. Now, he unveiled it to rapturous applause. The manuscript, smuggled out on thousands of scraps of paper, was edited and published as Inside the Third Reich. It was an instant, global phenomenon. The book was not just a success, it was a cultural event. a runaway bestseller that flew off the shelves in London, New York, and Paris. It was translated into dozens of languages. Albert Speer, the convicted war criminal, had become the most successful author to ever emerge from the wreckage of the Nazi regime. The book's genius lay in what it offered the reader, a keyhole view into the very heart of darkness, guided by a man who seemed to have survived with his intellect and sanity intact. Speer gave the world what it craved, an explanation. He explained the inexplicable. He made the monstrously inhuman seem tragically human. He presented the Nazi leadership not as one-dimensional demons, but as a cast of flawed, vain, and incompetent characters, all dancing to the tune of one hypnotic master. And he, the narrator, was the reasonable man, the reluctant courtier, the one person the reader could identify with. He had created the perfect product for the post-war world. He was the Nazi you could invite to dinner, and the invitations poured in. He became a media superstar, a fixture on television talk shows and in the pages of glossy magazines. He gave a famous, lengthy interview to Playboy, an act of surreal cultural normalization. He sat across from talk show hosts, speaking in his calm, professorial tone, his face a mask of thoughtful contrition. He was handsome, articulate, and radiated an aura of deep, sorrowful wisdom. He spoke of his guilt and his failure to see, and audiences were captivated. Here was a man who had stood at the devil's shoulder and had come back to tell the tale, not as a monster, but as a penitent. He became the world's go-to expert on the Third Reich. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers flocked to him. He was the ultimate primary source, the man who could offer personal anecdotes about Hitler's vegetarianism, Goering's vanity, and Goebbels's cunning. He provided the humanizing details that made the horror feel comprehensible. He grew rich from the royalties. He bought a comfortable house near Heidelberg and lived the life of a respected public intellectual. He had achieved the final, impossible victory. He had not just escaped the noose at Nuremberg, he had escaped history itself. He had successfully laundered his past, transforming the blood money of slave labor into the clean, respectable currency of literary fame. His myth, the one he had so carefully designed in the solitude of his cell, was now a globally accepted fact. The architect's lie was his final, most enduring monument. For more than a decade after his release, the monument of Albert Speer's new life seemed impregnable. His books sold in the millions, his television appearances were ratings gold, and his version of history was largely accepted as fact. He had built a fortress of lies so grand and so convincing that it seemed it would stand forever. But history is a patient hunter, and truth, like water, always searches for a crack. While the public and the media were captivated by the charming, repentant Nazi, a new generation of more critical, less forgiving historians began to look closer. They were not seduced by his persona. To them, the story was too neat, too perfect. The character of the good Nazi felt less like a historical figure and more like a masterful literary creation. And so, they began to dig. The first significant crack appeared not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in the quiet, dusty archives of Germany. It did not come from a bombshell revelation about the death camps, but from a colder, more bureaucratic corner of his past, the Germania Project. A young historian, Matthias Schmidt, meticulously went through the records of Speer's Office of the General Building Inspector, GBI. He found what Speer had been so sure was lost or unimportant: the paperwork. There, in dry, bureaucratic language, were memos and chronicles detailing the GBI's central role in the eviction of Berlin's Jews. These were not vague orders from above. These were internal documents from Speer's own department, cataloging Judenwohnungen, Jewish apartments, as they became available for displaced Aryan tenants. The documents showed a man intimately involved not just in designing buildings, but in managing the human cost of those designs. When confronted with this evidence in the late 1970s, Speer's smooth composure faltered. He was dismissive, evasive. He fell back on his old defenses. He claimed he was merely solving a housing problem. He argued that he was the artist, the visionary, focused on the grand scale of his project, not the petty details of tenant relocation. It was a stunning display of moral blindness, but for the first time, it didn't work. The documents were irrefutable. His hands were clearly on the levers of persecution. The crack, once made, began to widen. Other historians, inspired by this breakthrough, began to pull at other loose threads. They re-examined his role in the slave labor system, finding records of meetings where the brutal realities were discussed in his presence. They found letters he had written, requests he had made, that proved he was not just a passive recipient of slave laborers, but an active and demanding consumer. His claims that he was an opponent of the brutal Fritz Sauckel were shown to be a lie. In reality, they were partners in a vast enterprise of human exploitation. The questions were no longer whispers among a few skeptical academics. They were becoming a public chorus. The man who had built his reputation on being the one who didn't know was now being buried under an avalanche of evidence proving that he did. The elegant facade of the thoughtful penitent was starting to show hairline fractures, revealing the cold, calculating face of the master builder underneath. The architect, for the first time since Nuremberg, was beginning to look like a man trapped in a structure of his own design, hearing the first ominous groans of its foundations. The final pillar supporting the magnificent edifice of Albert Speer's myth was his most sacred and fiercely guarded lie, his absolute ignorance of the Holocaust. He had confessed to using slave labor, albeit with caveats. He had admitted to his role in a criminal regime. But on the matter of the final solution, he was adamant. He had not known. He had not seen. He had not heard. It was the keystone in the arch of his deception, the one lie that separated him from the likes of Himmler and Eichmann and allowed the world to see him as a fundamentally decent man. And it was this final pillar that would be pulverized by history, revealing that his entire life's work after 1945 was not a memoir, but a monumental, architectural fraud. The moment of truth, the historical ground zero, was a speech given by Heinrich Himmler in the town of Posen on October 6, 1943. In a closed meeting, the SS chief spoke to the assembled leadership of the Reich, the Gauleiters, the ministers, the highest functionaries of the state, and what he said was not cloaked in euphemism. It was chillingly, brutally explicit. He spoke of the extermination of the Jewish race. He told the men in the room, "Most of you will know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500, or 1,000. To have endured this and to have remained decent, that has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written." And Albert Speer was there. In his memoirs, he constructed his most audacious and clever alibi. He admitted he was in Posen that day, but claimed he left the hall just before Himmler's fateful speech, suffering from fatigue, to travel to a meeting with Hitler. For decades, this was accepted. It was the perfect escape clause. It was a lie, a complete and total fabrication. Later historical analysis of his own office logs, of Hitler's appointment calendar, of the Reich's railway schedules, proved there was no such meeting with Hitler. It never happened. Speer, the Minister of Armaments, a central figure in the war effort, did not simply walk out of the most important secret meeting of the year. He sat in that hall. He heard every word. He listened as Himmler described, in graphic terms, the industrial-scale murder that his own slave laborers were being subjected to. He heard about the corpses lying side by side, and he did nothing. With the collapse of this keystone, the entire structure of his lies came crashing down. The pattern became undeniable. Every crime had been hidden behind a carefully constructed wall of denial, a separate, bespoke lie for every inconvenient truth. the eviction of Berlin's Jews for the Germania project. That was just a housing problem, a bureaucratic detail beneath his notice. The millions of slaves dying in his factories. That was the responsibility of his subordinate, Fritz Sockel, the procurement man. The Holocaust itself, he wasn't in the room for that speech. He was the architect of lies, and his blueprint was consistent: compartmentalize the crime, deflect responsibility downwards, and feign ignorance. He was not the good Nazi. He was, in many ways, the most modern and terrifying Nazi of all. He was not a frothing fanatic or a jackbooted thug. He was the calm, rational, amoral technocrat, the man for whom human lives were just another resource to be managed, another column on a spreadsheet. His evil was not hot-blooded hatred. It was the cold, sterile indifference of a man willing to do anything, sign anything, and ignore anything to realize his own towering ambition. He did not need to love the ideology. He only needed the opportunities it provided. He was the ultimate professional in a regime of criminals, the man who perfected the bureaucracy of murder. And his final project, the myth of his own innocence, was the most dishonest structure he ever built. Albert Speer died on September 1st, 1981, in a London hotel room, suffering a stroke while in the city to participate in a BBC program. He died as he had lived for nearly 4 decades, as a respected public figure, a best-selling author, a sought-after historical commentator. He had escaped the hangman's noose and had outlived his accusers, his rivals, and even most of his admirers. In the end, he seemed to have won. But history renders its verdict on its own schedule. Speer, the architect, had been obsessed with his own theory of ruin value. He designed his monumental buildings to crumble beautifully, to leave behind awe-inspiring ruins that would testify to the glory of the Third Reich 1,000 years in the future. It is a profound and fitting irony that his physical creations have all but vanished, the new Reich Chancellery destroyed, the Germania project a phantom on a blueprint, while the one great structure he spent half his life building, the myth of the good Nazi, is what now lies in total ruin. He did not escape judgment, he merely postponed it. The final verdict, delivered not by a court of law but by a court of historical fact, is damning and absolute. Albert Speer was a central pillar of the Nazi regime, a man whose managerial genius prolonged the war by years at the cost of millions of lives. He was a master of slaves who worked 7 million foreign laborers and countless concentration camp inmates to death. And he knew. He knew about the evictions, he knew about the brutal conditions in his factories, and he knew about the Holocaust. He was in the room. His legacy is not one of stone, but one of moral cowardice. He represents a uniquely modern and chilling form of evil, not the evil of the snarling fanatic, but the quiet, banal evil of the ambitious professional. He was the man in the tailored suit who was willing to overlook any atrocity, sign any order, and deny any reality in the service of his own career. His sin was not hatred, but a bottomless, soul-corroding indifference. He was dangerous not because he was a monster, but because he was so recognizably, frighteningly human, a man who chose ambition over conscience at every turn. In the end, his own theory of ruin value turned against him. The persona he constructed with such architectural precision, the penitent technocrat, the hypnotized artist, the man who didn't know, has been demolished as surely as his Reich Chancellery was dynamited by the Soviets. What is left are the ruins of a reputation, a testament to a lie of monumental proportions. And these ruins, unlike the ones he dreamed of, inspire no awe. They serve only as a permanent, cautionary monument to the fact that the most elaborate structures built on a foundation of deceit are destined, eventually, to collapse into dust. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.